In the previous lecture, we predominantly focused on the Eastern Church and the Greek-speaking church, and part of this is based on the chronology and the time, where the church was at the time. In today's lecture, we're going to focus on the westward expansion of the church, it taking on its Catholic nature, and what missions look like under this Catholic paradigm. This is the medieval mission paradigm. And there's a couple elements about the context that have changed that we need to clue ourselves in on. The first is that the predominant language has shifted from Greek to Latin. And so many of the church councils that have already taken place at this time have been done so from a Greek-speaking background, from a Greek philosophical perspective and Greek cultural perspective. And now this is moving into the Latin world. The second thing is that the church is struggling through and trying to find its footing as it's gone from being persecuted to being granted not just clemency, but state recognition and becoming the official state religion. So something that never had the idea that it should be joined to the state is now completely joined to the state. It's gone from being a very small movement of a persecuted sect of Judaism to being a large accepted state religion. It's gone from being persecuted to being protected. It's gone from being a harassed sect to the oppressor of sects. And so now Christianity, because there are subdivisions, we talked about Gnosticism, and there are many, many new heresies that have been developing. Now they have a state-backed program to help them persecute sectarianism. And finally, it severed the link with Judaism. Now this was predominantly from the Judaic side that this was severed, but the link was severed nonetheless. So there's this new context now that is more Western, that is Latin, that is large, and that is joined to the state. And so that is where we pick up. And so one of the first main characters during this medieval period is Agustin of Hippo. He is probably most known for his book called The City of God. And the City of God was a kind of apologetic. It was a defense that Christians were not to blame and were not the problem, with the reasons why the Roman Empire was being attacked by barbarians. And I guess at this point, about 410, Rome itself had been sacked by barbarian invaders. And so in this book, he promotes the idea of two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And both of these cities, the city of God and the city of man, they're both spiritual cities, and they both inhabit a physical city. And so he's trying to identify a difference with kind of our ultimate purpose and allegiance and what is kind of ontologically or spiritually happening in a city versus just its physical structures. And so he would say that when the spiritual city is led, its physical leader is also a Christian. So you have both cities united. You have the physical city with a Christian leader sitting on the throne, as it were, combined with uniting the spiritual side of the city of God, that the Christian ruler is expected that he does the bidding of both. And so the kingly ruler, the mayor, whatever you want to call the person over the city, he is responsible for both realms, and an attack on either realm is an attack on the other. And so he kind of unites two worlds that are otherwise worlds apart. Boniface VIII, he ran with this idea. And so this just created an interesting social theory that guided Europe probably for centuries and perhaps even to this day. So monarchs are seen to be not just a secular ruler, but they are seen to be ruling by divine right on behalf of God. And so they have state obligations, but they also have obligations to the church. And so when they go to war, it is not just war, it is war on behalf of the state, but with the blessing of God, or vice versa, on behalf of God with the blessing of the state. And so it's really a question, there's a tension here that's obviously created as to, which of these chairs, the spiritual chair or the physical chair, is kind of taking leadership in each of these decisions. Now, what on earth does this have to do with missions, you're probably wondering. Uh, and the reality is that mission, as we have described it up to this point, hasn't always been such a tight and needy box. And this is a neat box. This is partly why we talk about paradigms and paradigms being changed over time, is because you understand that the paradigm that we're operating from in the modern world is very different than the paradigm that was being operated from back at this time. And so Boniface, he ran with this idea of a united Christian leader in the physical city who also held sway in the spiritual city. And he had a famous bull or injunction called Unum Sanctum. This is in 1302. He declared that both the temporal sword and the spiritual sword had been entrusted to the church. Now, think back several hundred years before, or 1,000 years before, the time of Christ. This is not a notion that they had adopted. This is not a notion for Paul and the early apostles. This is not a notion for the first century apologists that they should wield the sword. Remember our discussion on the letter of Diognetus, the letter to Diognetus, sorry. That letter described Christianity as, look, we are not just citizens, we are the best kind of citizens that you could have. We do all of the things that make us patriotic and loyal to the state, only we don't get into these sins. We don't sacrifice our children, and we don't share our beds. But aside from that, in language and clothes and dress and loyalty, we're all the same. Now you're turn the page, and we're looking at a church that says we not only bear the spiritual sword, the Word of God, we bear the temporal sword. We are God's army on earth. What can go wrong? There's an important letter that Charlemagne wrote to Pope Leo III in 796. So it's a little bit before this Unum Sanctum. And he said that the task of emperor was to defend the Holy Church of Christ everywhere against the assault of pagans and the ravages of unbelievers. And so loyalty to the state is equal to loyalty to the church. The reverse is also true. Disloyalty to the state is equal to disloyalty to the church. And so this leads to an important element. What do you do with people who are disloyal to the church? Because that is tantamount to treason, tantamount to being disloyal to the state, treason. And so there were numerous theories, and these kind of grow exponentially, and I would argue, they get out of control as time goes on. And so for Augustine and many of the people of his time, at least how Augustine started, one of their go-to passages, this was the passage where Jesus is talking about a man throwing a banquet, a wedding feast, and he invites his guests, and his guests are too busy. And so he sends his servants back out, and he says, compel them to come in. This is Luke 14:23. Compel them to come in. And so Augustine would see those who were creating schisms, who were separating off from the church, as they should be compelled. Now, people who are leaving the church, at that time it was the Donatists, people who were leaving the church or trying to leave the church and do their own thing, create their own sect, they are of a different category, at least at this point in time in the mind of Augustine. They are of a different category than people who are what they are calling pagans or unbelievers. And so Augustine would say, compel the Donatists, but we must reach the unbelievers with the gospel. But this, this evolves over time, even for Augustine. This isn't his final position. So he moved from a position of compelling, we'll call them sectarians, people who are trying to split off. He wanted to compel them to re-Catholicize, to rejoin the Catholic Church, to reunite with the Catholic Church. And so he went from this extreme over here, which that doesn't feel very extreme, to the other extreme of holy war. Just war. Just war. Holy war is next. But just war, he's very famous for his views on just war theory. Just war theory is primarily a defense theory, that it is okay for us to defend ourselves when attacked. But obviously, now the church holds both swords, the spirit sword and the temporal sword. Now we have a just war theory in mind. All of a sudden, the lines get blurred really, really quickly, and it's easier and easier to make progress progress in this paradigm. And so you go from Augustine, who has the whole just war theory, to Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great has a new innovation on just wars, and he calls them holy wars. So holy wars are no longer just defensive, these are offensive. And so they are able to go on the offense to subjugate people to Christian rule and to the empire. And this is viewed as the task of the church. Or is it the state? Or is it the state on behalf? See, here's the issue. And so we're not just subjugating them via planting a church and inviting them to join and participate in the body of Christ. We are compelling them politically with the armies of the state / the armies of God. And so this is a very different, very different model. But the line here between people who are schismatic, okay, so you could create a schism without necessarily being a heretic. That's the second category. So the line between schismatics, between heretics, and then between pagans, complete outsiders to the church. These lines become blurred. And so Augustine's view that we should have more of a strong arm approach, either through taxation or other kinds of levy placed on the Donatists and other groups that were splitting off versus attacking our enemies, those two things get conflated really, really quickly. And you see things like the Inquisition come out of this model, where it gets very, very brutal. When we start talking about holy wars, we're still a step down from kind of the archetype of Christians in power gone bad, and that is crusade. And so crusades are what Bosch calls missionary wars. And so in these wars, their goal is not just to subjugate people to Christian rule and to the church. It is literally to destroy pagan armies. And so this launches a very bloody period. Now, if you studied history of Europe or the Middle East, for that matter, you've undoubtedly read about the Crusades, and typically they're described as the First Crusade and Second and Third and Fourth and so on. The reality, while these distinctions might be helpful, especially in taking tests and whatnot, or just being descriptive, the reality is that it's simply a time period of crusading. And so one crusade kind of bled into the next crusade. And so the real question is not, when did the Crusades start? The real question is, when did they end? And there are some people who would argue that the global exploration of Christopher Columbus and the other early explorers was actually a kind of crusading. It was a race to outflank the Muslims. And so part of the crusade, part of the goal behind the Crusades was to stop the onslaught of the Muslim invasion. Part of it was to retake Jerusalem, the holy city. And part of it was also to subjugate God's enemies. Pope Urban II says, and this is his decree espousing Crusades, he says, "I say to those who are present, I command that it be said to those who are absent, Christ commands it. All who go thither," that means there, "and lose their lives, be it on the road or on the sea or in the fight against the pagans, will be granted immediate forgiveness of their sins. This I grant to all who will march by virtue of the great gift which God has given me." Now, if you've been following political news in the modern era, we're very aware of the idea of Islamic Jihad. And this is, I would say, that this idea has largely been hijacked by people who are militant in its application. But I think this is where we have to be careful, and there's a great example here in being careful how we address another faith. And that is because in many points of our own faith, we could take that speech from Pope Urban and we could change out our terms for Islamic terms, and it would sound very, very similar to speeches from people that we would probably call terrorists have given to their followers to go and kill on behalf of their religion. The Crusades they were largely failures. You had things like the Children's Crusade and the Peasant Crusade. Those ended when slavers showed up at the port and promised to take them to where they were going and essentially sold them into slavery. The First Crusade, though, actually managed to reach Jerusalem. But even when the Crusades were successful, their vision of success was extreme brutality. And so along the way, they would sack Jewish towns and Christian towns. They would steal what they needed to fund and to feed their armies. When they got to Jerusalem, it got really grim. They killed, of course, Muslims. They also killed Jews, who they lumped in with the infidels. And lastly, and most disturbingly, they also killed fellow Christians. And so even if their aim was to kind of purge the Holy Land of pagans, as they would call them, they're doing a terrible job because they're also killing their own side. And part of it was they were basically killing people that didn't look like them without much awareness that Christians in the Middle East don't look like them. They don't look Christian, and by Christian I mean European. And so they would see them wearing what they thought were Muslim clothes, and they weren't. They were just Middle Eastern clothes. And so they would burn down synagogue and mosque alike, and they would kill, rape, and pillage. It was a very bloody day. In one day, they killed 75,000 people. So this is a very, very bloody mark. But the men who led this First Crusade, they were so overcome by this false sense of piety that they wouldn't wear a crown coming into a city. One had a donkey brought for him so he could ride on the donkey into the gates. And he also had a crown of thorns placed on his head. And so in some ways they tried to re-narrate their advance into Jerusalem as the peaceful advance of Christ into Jerusalem during Passion Week. Obviously, this is not at all the case. But Crusades and colonization are both fruits from this medieval paradigm of doing mission. And so colonization we'll talk about much later, and if you're aware, it does come much, much later in the story, but this is just simply the next application from the time of Crusades. Bosch says, colonialism and mission, as a matter of course, are interdependent. The right to have colonies carried with it the duty to Christianize the colonized. And so during the time where the colonial powers ruled much of the world, the Christian mission associations, they would petition the government to do more to Christianize the lost. And they saw this as a mandate, as a divine right, as a responsibility, that as long as we're going in and taking control of countries, we also have the mandate to Christianize. But not everything during this time period was all war and killing and pillaging and raping. There were some luminaries of this time. Raymond Law and Francis of Assisi were two. Francis of Assisi was interesting because he was on some of the early Crusades, and something happened to him where he realized, hey, this is not what God wants in the world. And we know that some things about his life we know, some things we don't. We do know that he went to Egypt, and he saw Salahuddin, who was the Muslim ruler at the time. He had a conversation with him in the tent. We don't know exactly what is said. Christine Malouhi, who wrote the book Waging Peace on Islam, says that there was a kind of two-way conversion. And I think maybe the use of conversion is not in a soteriological sense, but the two-way conversion she's describing is kind of a new understanding and appreciation of the other person. And so one thing, I don't know how much you know about Islam, but one of the things that has actually been a point of disagreement between Muslims and Christians is not so much the differences between the religions, but actually the similarities. And it's on these points that both Muslims and Christians feel the same exact sense from the same sources, the divine right to interpret and explain the message of monotheism. But Raymond Law was a different case altogether. He was born in a part of Spain that had once been under Muslim rule. And so he grew up being aware of Muslim theology, And in his elder years, he wanted to go as a missionary to North Africa. And he purchased an Arab slave who would teach him Arabic so that he could share with the people when he went. And instead of hopping on a boat and going to war, he hopped on a boat to head to North Africa and to share the gospel. He had a bit of a mishap with his slave Arabic teacher, in that the slave blasphemed Jesus, and then lunged at Raymond Law, who beat him with a fire poker thing, and the slave was taken to prison and to court, but committed suicide while in prison. His very first attempt to go to North Africa, he got on the boat, got so terrified that he immediately got off the boat. And he was so ashamed and repentant of this that he vowed the very next boat he would get on and he would go to North Africa. And so he took 3 trips to North Africa. And I think part of his goal, and he was 75 when he went, so part of his goal was martyrdom. There were a number of interesting characters at this time that were seeking out martyrdom for the cause of Christ. And so on his 3rd trip, he was finally granted such a martyrdom, though they almost killed him on 2 of his 3 trips. And so he was the first missionary in the modern era, anytime after, let's say, Pentecost, to go taking the gospel to North Africa. And he would be the last missionary to North Africa until 1822, which is when the next missionary went there. So this period of time is very, very violent, and a lot of this is the result of joining church and state, joining the Word of God and the army of now God, but the state. Bosch makes an interesting observation, and I think this is probably true not just of his book, but of many missions books, especially if they start talking chronologically. And that is, he says, thus far in this book, I've used the word mission as though it has always been the conventional designation for the activity of proclaiming and embodying the gospel amongst those who had not yet embraced it. But he says, look, this is anachronistic. I've been using this word to talk, and I've done the same thing in this class. We've used this word to describe all of this process. But as we dial down into colonialism more in the coming modules, you're going to understand there's, many of the colonial missionaries are who we hold to be kind of the first true missionaries, and a lot of them are missionary heroes. Maybe you've read their books when you were a kid. I know I did, and these were people that were held up to us. But by and large, there's a largely negative connotation with colonization. And so he says the Latin word missio was an expression employed in the doctrine of the Trinity. This is describing that the Father has sent his Son. And so this sending is described in Latin as missio. He says for 15 centuries, the church used other terms to describe what we call mission. Phrases such as propagation of the faith, apostolic proclamation, promulgation of the gospel, preaching the gospel, augmenting the faith, expanding the church, planting the church, propagating of the reign of Christ, and illuminating the nations. The real problem with the word mission, as he describes it, he says the new word mission is historically linked indissolubly with the colonial era and with the idea of a magisterial commissioning. The term presupposes an established church in Europe which dispatches delegates to convert overseas people and was, as such, an attendant phenomenon of European expansion. I agree with him. I do think that the term is directly linked to the time of European outreach into the world, expansion, political expansion. At the same time, life is short, and there's who wants to go around talking about promulgation of the faith? It's kind of a weighty mouthful. So this module right now is not that long, because this is just a brief time period in the various paradigms of faith. Although, as we said in the first session on what are paradigms, old paradigms, when new paradigms come in, don't simply cease to exist. They coexist. Sometimes they go underground. And so the writing prompt is a little bit about this. I've talked somewhat about just war theory, separation of church and state, or unification of church and state, and holy war. So pick any of those. Pick just war theory, separation of church and state, unification of church and state, or holy war, and describe the bearing that these have on our present day. Now, I'm speaking specifically in the North American context. You don't take all of those, but just pick one of them and talk about what are the vestiges of that paradigm or that mentality that we can see on either side, either on the church side or on the political side. I think this will be an interesting conversation to consider, especially in light of our present socio-political scenario we find ourselves in today.